Mummies Made in Egypt by Aliki. Mummies Made in Egypt. The ancient Egyptians had one great wish. That wish was to live forever. Egyptians believed that after they died, a new life began. They would live in their tombs as they lived on earth. They would also travel to another world to live with gods and goddesses of the dead. Some of the gods and goddesses of the dead: Tmoth, ibis-headed god of scribes; Horus, god of the sky, son of Osiris; Ujat, magic eye of Horus, perfecter of the dead; Anubis, jackal-headed god of embalmers; Geb, god of earth; Hathor, goddess of the city of Dendera; Isis, wife of Osiris, mother of Horus; Nephthys, sister of Isis; Tefnut, goddess of moisture; Shu, god of air; Re, Horakti, Horus of the twin horizons; and Osiris, prince of the dead, god of the underworld. Egyptians believed everyone had a Ba, or soul, and a Ka, an invisible twin of the person. They believed that when a person died, his Ba and Ka were released from his body and lived on in the tomb. The Ba would keep contact with the living family and friends of the dead. The Ka traveled back and forth from the body to the other world. In order for a person to live forever, the Ba and Ka had to be able to recognize the body, or they could not return to it. This is why the body had to be preserved or mummified. The Ba was represented as a bird with a human head, the dead person and his Ka. The Ba returned to the mummy at night. It was believed the dead traveled to the other world in a boat. A mummy is a corpse that has been dried out so it will not decay. The earliest Egyptians were mummified naturally. The corpse was buried in the ground. The hot, dry sand of Egypt dried out the body. The preserved body turned as hard as stone into a fossil. The corpse was buried in a crouching position. Jars of food were buried with it for use in the new life. As time went on, burials became more elaborate. The dead were wrapped in a shroud of cloth or skin. They were buried in pits lined with wood or stone, or in caves. Bodies not buried directly in the sand became exposed to dampness, air, and bacteria. They decayed. So people learned how to embalm or mummify their dead. It took centuries of practice to perfect the art. Embalmers became so expert that the mummies they made remained preserved for thousands of years. Bodies were laid prone before being wrapped. Today, scientists use X-ray machines to study mummies through their wrappings. Mummification was a long, complicated, and expensive process. People were mummified and buried according to what they could afford. The poor had modest burials. Noblemen and others who served the king and his queen had elaborate burials. Pharaohs, the king of Egypt, were the richest of all. It was believed, too, that a pharaoh became a god when he died, so pharaohs were mummified, the best, and buried in splendor. Egyptians embalmed animals, too. They mummified them the way they did people and buried them as sacrifices to a god or goddess. The mummy of a cat with its face painted on its wrappings. The mummy of a falcon inside its coffin. The mummy of a crocodile with eyes sewn on its linen wrappings. It took 70 days for embalmers to prepare a body. For a royal or noble burial, embalmers worked in workshops near the tomb where the mummy would be buried. Priests held ceremonies for each step of the mummification process. Assistants brought supplies to the embalmers. Embalmers first took out the inner organs. They removed the brain through the nostrils with metal hooks. They made a slit in the side of the body and took out the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. Each of these organs was embalmed in a chemical natron and put in its own container called a canopic jar. The heart was left in its place. Small bundles of natron wrapped in linen were stuffed inside the body. The outside was covered with natron too. The chemical dried out the body the same way the sand had done. In later times, the heart was removed and embalmed in a stone Scarab was put in its place. The corpse's brain was removed and probably thrown away. The inner organs were removed. The body cavity was stuffed with bundles of natron. The corpse was placed on a slanted embalming bed with a groove at the bottom. It was covered with natron, a grainy chemical found in deposits in the Nile River. Fluids from the corpse dripped into a container as the body dried out. The canopic jars and the gods that guarded them. Hepi, the lungs, Duamutef, the stomach, Imseti, the liver, Websinuf, the intestines. The internal organs were mummified separately from the body. Each organ was wrapped in linen and covered with a mask of the god that protected it. Then each mummified organ was put into its own canopic jar. The lid of the jar also bore the image of the god. After 40 days, the natron packs were removed. The dried, shrunken body was sponged clean and brushed with oils, ointments, spices, and resin. The head and body were stuffed with new packing, soaked in the same substances. The eye sockets were plugged with linen and closed. The nostrils were stuffed with beeswax. The arms were crossed, and the mummy's fingernails and toenails were covered with caps of gold. The embalming cut was sewn together. The mummy was adorned with jewels of gold and precious stones. Then the body was carefully bound with long, narrow strips of linen. Fingers, toes, arms, and legs were wrapped individually. Linen shrouds were placed between the layers of binding, and even every few layers were glued together with resin. After 20 layers of shroud and binding, the mummy's body took on its normal size. It was possible during the long process that a piece of the corpse, an ear or a toe, would fall off. This and all leftover material used for the embalming were saved in jars to be buried near the tomb. A layer of binding was covered with a shroud. Another layer of binding was placed over that, then another shroud, and so on for 20 layers. The person's name was written on the binding. Magical amulets were tucked in between the mummy's wrappings. The small mummy-shaped figures called shabtis held farm tools. The shabtis would work in the field of the other world for the mummy. The bound head was covered with a portrait mask. If anything happened to the mummy, the Ba and the Ka would still be able to recognize it. The mask, too, was bound. Then the whole package was wrapped in a shroud and given a last coat of resin. The mummy was finished. Some of the many amulets found on mummies. Sometimes hundreds of shabtis were buried with the mummy. A shabti figure. Scarab, symbol of renewed life. Ujat, protective eye of Horus. Lotus, symbol of rebirth. Headrest for the mummy's comfort. Jed column, symbol of Osiris's backbone. Ua scepter, symbol of well-being. Steps, leading up to the throne of Osiris. Knot of Isis, symbol of fertility. Ankh, sign of life. 2 arms symbolizing Ka. Shen, symbol of infertility. Writing board for the mummy's use. Many portrait masks were made of cartonnage, a material made of linen and plaster. They were molded and painted. Sometimes masks were made of gold and inlaid with precious stones. Often they bore the plaited beard of Osiris. A collection of spella called the Book of the Dead was buried with the mummy. The spells, written and illustrated on scrolls of papyrus, were to help the dead find everlasting life. Meanwhile, skilled artists, sculptors, and carpenters prepared for the burial. They made the coffin, or a nest of coffins, for the mummy. The coffins were painted inside and out with gods, goddesses, and magic spells of protection. For a period of time, mummies were buried on their sides so that they could look out of the eyes painted on the wooden coffin. Later, mummies were buried in mummy-shaped coffins made of wood or plaster and painted. Carpenters prepare a mummiform coffin. A nest of 3 mummiform coffins. The mummy was put into the inner coffin. The inner coffin was covered and placed inside a second covered coffin. which fitted inside an outer coffin. The outer coffin was covered. Eventually, these coffins would be placed into a stone coffin called a sarcophagus. Magic spells were painted on the coffins and hieroglyphs, the picture writing used by the ancient Egyptians. They made jewelry for the mummy and furniture that would be buried in the tomb. They carved statues of the dead person to be placed in the tomb. These would serve as resting places for the Ba and the Ka should anything happen to the mummy. A splendid stone sarcophagus was made to hold the coffin. The walls of the royal tombs were carved and painted with scenes that would magically come alive. The scenes showed the person's new life in the other world. Dancers and musicians entertained him. Servants worked in the fields and carried food for him to eat. The gods and goddesses of the dead welcomed him. A long, solemn funeral procession took the mummy to the tomb. The mummy rested on an elaborate sled pulled by oxen. Another sled carried the canopic jars in a chest. Priests, family, servants, and mourners who were paid to weep followed. Porters carried the many possessions that would be buried with the mummy. A tomb was no longer just a pit. It was a house for the mummy, the Ba and the Ka, that was made to last forever. A royal tomb was also a fortress against robbers who tried to steal mummies and their treasures. Tombs were more important than houses to Egyptians. People had them built during their lifetime. For centuries, the dead were usually buried in tombs called mastabas. Mastabas were made of brick and stone. Royal mastabas had many storage chambers and were beautifully carved and decorated. Shaft, false door, burial chamber. A mastaba. The mummy was lowered down the shaft to the burial chamber. It was thought that the Ba used the shaft to return to the mummy at night. Each tomb had a false door through which the Ka could come and go. As years went by, pharaohs took more and more with them into the tomb. Tombs became bigger, stronger, and more elaborate. For a long time, pharaohs had pyramids built for themselves. Pyramids were huge stone monuments that took hundreds of workers their lifetime to build. Groups of workers cut and dragged the huge blocks of stone up mud ramps, starting at each corner of the pyramid. As the pyramid grew, another ramp was added. It took 2 million blocks to build a great pyramid. Tombs were built in the desert, where the land could not be farmed. Sometimes the mourners brought the mummy by boat up the Nile River. The boat that carried the mummy was buried near the tomb for the mummy's use in the new life. The pyramid covered the pharaoh's burial chamber. Near it were temples, storage chambers, and mastabas where the royal family and servants would be buried. Later, pharaohs were buried in secret underground tombs in a deserted place that is known as the Valley of Kings. Tunnels, passages, chambers, and the tomb itself were cut deep in rock, hidden from sight. They were magnificently carved and painted, part of an underground tomb. A priest dressed as the god Anubis held the mummy up for the ceremony. The sarcophagus was closed. The mourners left the tomb for a funeral banquet. The leftover food was burned near the tomb. Thereafter, priests and family worshipped at the temple and brought food offerings to the mummy's Ka. Women wept and threw dust on their heads. When the funeral procession came to rest at the tomb, priests performed a final ritual on the mummy called the opening of the mouth. The mummy's mouth was not actually opened, but magically given the ability to speak and eat again. Then the mummy was put into the sarcophagus, which was covered with a heavy stone lid. The canopic chest, with the jars, guarded by their own gods, stood nearby. The mourners left, and the entrance to the tomb was sealed up with a wall of stone slabs. At last, the mummy was in its eternal resting place and on the way to its new life. It is said that the first Egyptians to be mummified was Osiris, a legendary king. He was embalmed by Anubis, the jackal god. When Osiris died, he became a god. He was king of the underworld and prince of the dead. It was to Osiris's kingdom the dead wished to go. Many of the illustrations in this book were adapted from paintings and sculptures found in ancient Egyptian tombs.